Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Applying Ethology webinar. I'm Lara Whalen, a postdoctoral researcher at the Norwegian Veterinary Institute. As we begin today, I want to remind you all to please turn off your camera and microphone. Should you have questions for our speaker, please type them into the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. It is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Irene Camerlink. Irene is an associate professor in the Department of Animal Behavior and Welfare at the Institute of Genetics and Animal Biotechnology at the Polish Academy of Sciences. She has had extensive research experience with pigs in the Netherlands, the UK, and Austria before taking up her current position. She is also the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Applied Animal Behavior Science, and herself a prolific author who has had over 80 publications within 10 years of her career. Irene, welcome, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for the introduction. It's quite a mouthful of words to pronounce. Okay, hello, everyone. Nice to see so many of you here online. I'll just move this box to the side. So this webinar is based on the ISE workshops that was last year, if I'm correct, 2021. So for those of you who have been there, it might be a bit double. I added some new things, but you might see some similarities. For those who it's new, it's excellent. It's prepared together with Peter Pongwas, my co-editor-in-chief of the journal. Let me see how I move further. So as Laura already mentioned, I'm editor-in-chief of Applied Animal Behavior Science, and mostly from that role, I'm presenting the current webinar. I deal with all the manuscripts on farm animals, whereas Peter does with all the other species, so that you know, if you submit to Applied Animal Behavior Science, you now know where your manuscript goes. We have 5 associate editors, so they deal with several manuscripts as well. But in a year, I usually see around 200 to 300 manuscripts. And that's what's mostly the basis of the kind of knowledge that I want to spread here through this webinar. So I just wanted to ask you as audience, but easiest is in the chat box because you have just been told not to unmute yourself. What is your reason for publishing? And just type something in the chat if that's possible to just see what's, because you know it's always interesting if I ask it, what is the first that comes up, and some come with something else. Sharing knowledge. Let's see. Only 2. This is just like lecturing, you know, you have so many people who clicked online and then everyone is just sleeping or watching something else. Peer reviewed, yeah. Because it's a requirement. Whew, that's a tough one then to publish. Yeah, indeed. Work not published is not done. Share scientific knowledge. If you have to publish it, you have to only publish because you have to, then it's a tough one. Okay. What I had written here is sharing your work, indeed, what you have in the chat as well, so that others can learn from it. But mainly also share your work so that others won't do the same. And one reason is that you reduce, you know, that other one replicates a failed method, but also reduce animals and including animal suffering, because not all animal experiments are without suffering. So it really contributes to the 3 R's in ethics to publish so that it won't happen again. Certainly if you have large sample size and if someone else would just do the same, it's a pity for the animals if it's not all on positive welfare, let's say it that way. So you contribute to research development, and a secondary priority is, of course, that it builds your research CV. I know for some it will be the first priority, but I think it is, well, in animal science, it's more ethically to publish it because of the animals that really need our help with getting research progress. But of course, it is really relevant in research or it's needed to publish, because if you don't publish, it is as if it's never happened. Others will do the same. And certainly if you consider how stressful work is, if it was all for nothing, more or less, then it's a pity. So the objective for today is to provide you as authors, in your role as author, insight in why manuscripts are commonly rejected and how you can avoid it. Also get some insight in how we make decisions as editors. And the long-term aim is, of course, to increase a bit the quality of submitted manuscripts and preventing rejections. This webinar is not about how you plan your publications, although I think it is very important. So do plan your publication, even if I don't inform you here how to do this. How to write manuscripts, also absolutely important to follow a writing course, but this is not a writing course because it's only a short time, 1 hour. How to choose a journal and how to submit a manuscript. For that, just see the journal website mostly. But feel free to ask any questions at the end, of course. So the first part will be a bit about rejections and general manuscript flaws, because you might think, oh, but my manuscripts don't get rejected. They might be in the future if you publish enough. And but in general, manuscript may have revisions that you could have prevented. And then the second part is about solutions. So the decisions that are usually made about a manuscript is accepted, final stage, minor revision. Some journals have moderate revision, not all of them, or major revision, or reject. And the reject has actually 2 versions. One is desk rejection, which is after an assessment by the editor, but before it goes to peer review. And you have rejection after peer review. You also can have in some journals reject but resubmit possible. That is that it's not good enough, but you are not necessarily invited, but you can resubmit it again to the same journal. If you're not invited to resubmit again, then try a different journal because the editors have made a decision usually. If it's not stated in the email that you receive what kind of revision it is, then it might be falling in between decisions, and some journals have a setup that they don't say specifically minor or major, but then well, in some cases the editor leaves it away. Just, if it's on the borderline between reject and major and they want to make really clear that you don't just accept it as major, but that you do a bit more, then it might be in between. Journals vary very strongly, but in how much they reject. The top journals like Nature Science have around 90% rejection rate. And even within our field, animal behavior, it's difficult to get into animal behavior unless you have some really cool animals that you're working with, or butterflies or dolphins. Otherwise, 73% is getting rejected. Another journal, 60, in applied animal behavior science, the rejection rate is around 60 to 65%. Around 50% is desk rejection before peer review and 15% after peer review. I think at the moment it's actually a bit lower because we are a bit stricter now in desk rejections. If you get the rejection, you're not the only one. As you see, 90% in some journals. It's very common, but in some countries and regions in the world, let's say that way, there are higher rejection rates than others, and you'll see later in the presentation why. For example, in this graph, it's from applied animal behavior science, though. You'll see Brazil, 61 manuscripts submitted, 13 accepted. China, 36 submitted, only 4 publications accepted. So, and in Canada, which has less, 12 submitted, 6, so 50% accepted. So it varies between regions, and it has to do mainly with research quality and experience with submitting. So how to avoid initial rejection? I'll go into more detail in each of these topics. One is out of scope or not enough sample size. If the experimental design is flawed, is there lack of novelty? There can be ethics concerns. I'm here not going into the details of ethics. Animal studies have to have ethics approval, usually if it's, well, at least if it's invasive studies. And well, I said I wouldn't go into detail, but if you don't have ethics approval, then you get into a gray area, whether it's accepted or not. And it depends on the journal, let's say that way. And that is a bit. Also, if there is really high overlap with already published papers, might be even your own papers, and you just have a second version and it's too similar to the first one. Or if there's plagiarism, and for this, any journal will have their plagiarism checker, and it just shows up with how much % overlap there is. And this might be also self-citations, that you have too much similarity with your own published work already. I first want to start with poor manuscript preparation, and this is not a reason for rejection. It's only, the first thing an editor does, opening the manuscript, and if the first impression is that it's a mess, it's not well prepared, it's not in line with the author guidelines, it's full of language errors, there's all kinds of missing information, it looks messy, it's clearly not enough details in the methods or the statistical analysis section, there's no cover letter, then it just has such a bad impression. I very honestly admit, if I can choose and I have limited time and I open such a manuscript, then I close it again and I first do the other ones, and the other ones just get priority because it's much easier to deal with good, well-prepared manuscripts. So I know there is this trend that you can submit your manuscript your way. You don't have to format it to the guidelines until you get more or less the publication accepted. It is indeed the case, like this difference between references, that you have the references in names or in numbers, that you can leave to the end. But simple basic things of following the author guidelines has to be done. Otherwise, it's bad impression. So the consequences, bad impression for editors and reviewers, if it goes to reviewers even, then it influences the evaluation. Certainly for reviewers, they can get very annoyed with even small typos. It might actually be returned to the authors before review, or even a completely rejected to be a new submission. Like that will be the rejection, but resubmission possible. It also may be that we as editors request for language to use a language editing service, and then it might cost you money, and it will give, of course, delays. It's also harder to find reviewers if from the abstract it already shows that it's poorly written. Then as a reviewer, they will also decline more often. So it gives delays. It might be needed that you have to pay for language editing, and overall you better avoid that you get a bad reputation, because it might influence the future manuscript reviews. So if you want to save time on the last moment, like, oh, I want to have it submitted before Christmas. I know Christmas is coming up, and I know before Christmas we get a lot of manuscripts, not the best ones, because you want to have it finished before Christmas. It's not a good idea in any case, because reviewers also want their holiday, so they will decline to review papers. Much better to wait until January, take your time and submit a good manuscript. Okay, so then the real reasons for rejection, one is out of scope, and that's sometimes it's quite simple one, because some manuscripts seem to be submitted just randomly, that we get things that really have no link to the topic of the journal. And that maybe it's based because of impact factor, and that you don't have to pay open access fees or so, and they just submit it and we just reject it in the best case. It also may be that it's experience in knowing to what journal to submit to. And we see here regional differences with how often we get really out of scope manuscripts. There also may be, of course, confusion between similar journal titles. I think you've all encountered this in our field, animal or animals, or applied animal behavior science and applied animal welfare science. There are several of them that look so similar that it's, from the thousands of journals that there are, it's very easy to confuse them. Also, if you're not fully aware of the details of the scope and you think you know the details of the scope, I had it myself as well, that you think this fits and it's, in the end, it doesn't. So then you can also get it rejected. And of course, for interdisciplinary studies, there's a risk of falling between journal scopes. you know, certainly with the more technology studies now on animal behavior, if you submit it to an animal behavior journal, they say, no, it contains too much technology. You submit it to an engineering journal and they say, no, it contains too much animal behavior. And then you are left with nothing. I'll later explain what you can do about this. If your manuscript is out of scope, in the lucky case, it is rejected directly. If you're unlucky, you might be waiting for months before you actually receive the decision from the editor. And this decision, you know, it only takes a few minutes. You open the manuscript, you say, oh, it's out of scope, reject. So that's within a minute usually done to see if it's out of scope. But you know, some editors are so busy, it can take a long time, and then you're just waiting for months for your manuscript decision, whereas it could have been avoided by just looking up the exact scope of the journal. Another reason is that the study might not be generalizable enough, so a too small sample size or not representative sample. Too small sample we do get still often in studies, even though there's a trend for especially in farm animals to have really large sample sizes nowadays. But you know, in some species, like here's pictured some zoo animals, it may be difficult to get large enough numbers. We generally apply that if you have less than 6 statistical units per treatment, then it's not enough for any statistics. Actually, you need at least 6 to know the difference, you know. So that we have now included that on the author guidelines, that is really the minimum that we would consider. But it doesn't mean that the N of 6 per treatment is always enough. You know, you have to take into account individual variation, and you have to just do power calculations to be sure what the right sample size is. What we also see very often is a weak experimental design. This takes usually a bit more effort from the editor to go through the manuscript and see what is really done. Unfortunately, we also get studies that really try to cover up the weakness in the design. If you're one of those authors, please don't try to cover up, just say it that there's a weakness, because otherwise it might go through 2 or 3 rounds of peer review before we finally get down to that really the sample size is not enough or some other confounding or weakness. And then the paper gets rejected in the end after all. But I know that if you're lucky and the reviewers don't notice it, you know, you can push through poor research and try to cover up by writing the methods in such a complicated, confusing way that the reviewers don't understand it and that they accept it in the end. That might be in the interest of the author getting a publication done. It's not in the interest of science. If we want to get progress in research, it is not in the benefit of anyone to try to publish poor research. So please, if you have poor research, just admit it or don't try to publish it, because we'll try to find it and still reject it in the end. But otherwise, just write openly about where the weaknesses is, and then you reduce the complexity of the design. That's usually a way, or sometimes a way to deal with it. So, for example, with sample sizes, we see that there are multiple observations, but they're not accounted for as repeated measures. But that is something that can be dealt with actually with statistics with major revisions. If there's confounding between treatments, then it's getting more difficult. But also there are some solutions. And as reviewers they provide, you know, sometimes very detailed comments on how things can be solved. As editors, we also try to think along on how we can use it in the end, suggest to author something that can still make the manuscript publishable. We're not out to reject everything, but yeah, if the suggestions are taken into account, that's another thing. So sometimes lack of anonymization, if there's order effects, may cause a weak design. And if there's a design that doesn't actually answer the research question. There are many more options, but these are just the main ones that we find. Then I think one of the main reasons that are given for rejection is lack of novelty by some journals, because it's just it's a very easy reason for journals to say it's not novel enough, reject it. But it's actually, I think it's a bit of an outdated excuse, because hey, someone recognizes the dog. Okay, so this, oh, sorry, I see in the chat that someone recognizes the dog. This is from the publication about novel, the slide from Peter. He chose this picture because there is a study on how much objects a dog can recognize, and then someone replicated the study, and then he wanted to say it's not novel to do exactly the same study on the same species just to prove that it happens again. But wait, I got distracted for a moment. But that's why this picture is there. And so it's easy reason to say that the study is not good enough, not novel enough, and that's why it's rejected. But if you consider that nowadays most journals publish exclusively online, in the past it used to be, of course, and still some journals, they print all the publications and they have a certain amount of pages that they have in their volume to print. And then if they would have too many, then they have to be selective. Now, if it's not printed, there's no limit to the internet. So it's a bit strange that they still say, oh no, lack of novelty, because we all know that repeatability and reproducibility are important aspects, of research, that it's not whatever is found in research, that it's not just in one lab, or one species that it's happening, but also if it happens across other scenarios, other countries, other species, and so on. Of course, there has to be a good reason to replicate the study if it's really replication, and a sound reason to do research again on new set of animals. Also, again, for the 3 R's, the ethics of research. For why would you do another study on animals just for doing research, if it's known already. Okay, that brings me to some solutions or recommendations, I can maybe better say, but try and see if it's a solution. So first of all, check the scope. For any journal, read or reread the scope before deciding to submit there. They might have changed it. For example, if they're new editors and they decide to change the scope slightly, or you might have confused the journal with another journal, and just check it again before you publish. If you're unsure about whether your manuscript fits the scope, just write a pre-submission inquiry to the journal editor. Even if the journal doesn't list on the website that they do this, you can always just try to just email the editor and say, I want to submit this, put the abstract, not just the title, and say, do you think it's suitable for this journal? And then you usually get a very quick response. We have now that we would provide within, I forgot what we said, maybe within 5 days or so, a response. Usually it's within a day that we say, no, this is not suitable, or it is suitable. And then you just know before you go through the whole process of submitting a manuscript. Then one solution is, if you have you write a cover letter, always write a cover letter, because it just shows you know what to do and you prepared it. And then you write why you think your manuscript fits the scope. And then if it's relevant, you can also refer to similar studies that are published in a journal. And that is the recommendation for if you have an interdisciplinary study, for example, what I mentioned with animal behavior and technology. if you write a good cover letter to explain that, you know, it is an interdisciplinary study which looks at animal behavior and engineering as an example, and then why this specific journal is the best choice for this in spite of that it's an interdisciplinary study and could also potentially have been somewhere else. And in this case, I would then also suggest to give examples of studies, also similar interdisciplinary studies published in the journal. Or you just choose a multidisciplinary journal in general, like PLOS ONE, which is listed in the category of multidisciplinary journals. I also mentioned this is why if you're in a hurry, if you don't want to risk that it gets rejected somewhere because of the scope, then you can straight away just publish it in this broader journal. So if it's rejected based on scope, you submit it somewhere else, not to the same journal, because the editors will be already, you know, they have made a decision, but do adjust for the manuscript for the new author guidelines, because we do get occasionally manuscripts that were rejected somewhere else and we get a cover letter with the wrong journal name even. That gives a bad impression, so avoid that. Then you follow the author guidelines. They're always on the website, sometimes in PDF, sometimes only on the web page, sometimes very long, sometimes very short. Even if very long, go through it because it's relevant and it's helpful to follow it. Simple things as line numbers, if they're not added, in some journals they add them automatically, in others not. If it is not added automatically and you left it away, then as editor we need to send it back to the authors to then manually add the line numbers. It's a disaster. Just add line numbers. If they're double, it's double. If it's not there, it is more risky. Or just read the author guidelines carefully. That's the advice. So also the word count of sections. If it's clearly too long, you know, then why would the editor send it out for review if it clearly needs to be cut massively already before review even. The number of tables and figures that are allowed. And for example, if it's a journal with highlights, these very short bullet points, you need to take into account the number of characters. These four go often wrong, and it just gives delay, absolutely. Then for English language, if the language is poor, that's not really a reason for rejection, because, you know, it can be fixed, it can be corrected, but the content needs to be understandable. If the editor can't understand what you're meaning, then it's not going to get through to peer review anyway, or at least not in applied or behavior science. I can only speak for our own journal. So make sure it is checked or read by a native speaker. We really recommend that it's proofread by a native English speaker who is familiar with the topic, because even if you send it to language editing services and they're not familiar with the topic, with the research field, they can sometimes make really strange or wrong word choices because they just don't know what the right words are. And then it may still flag up as that it needs major corrections in the language. And if you use the language editing service, it's really nice to mention it in the cover letter or attach a certificate, because if as editor or the reviewers, they know that it has been corrected, then it's just much easier process than we don't need to go through the language to see how much needs to be changed. And I just want to add for reviewers, because there was always the idea that you need to make corrections to the manuscript, including language, but it has changed so much that now language editing is a professional service that authors pay for. Reviewing is voluntary. It's not that we, as reviewer, we shouldn't take over the role, which is actually a paid job. So you can comment on the language if you want, but you don't have to. And definitely, if it's poor language, just make a note to the editor and say, this manuscript needs thorough language editing. And that's enough. You know, you don't need to do a job that's actually from someone else. And as a reminder, for all the ISE members, there is this free help with English scheme. It takes a bit more time, but it's generally good to just prioritize quality over time. And I think it's one of the main benefits from being an ISE member, that you can just send your manuscript for correction there. Then a bit about the methods. So this is when it's, which you can't change the design anymore, but you can change how you write it down. And very often the methods are not written down clearly enough, and that leads to major revisions at least. And for the methods, you need to provide all the other aspects that can influence the outcomes. So this seems very much the basics. I just provided a list of what you have as standard kind of content of the methods of an animal science paper, more or less. You know, what kind of animals there were, what is the housing, what is the design, the tests, how are the samples collected, if there are samples, and the units. That is simple basic things. But from seeing so many manuscripts a year for several years, it's just clear that what we consider as basics are not basic knowledge everywhere or for everyone at every career stage, and that not everyone is taught the basics in their masters, for example. So I just listed here again, but the main thing is look at studies which are published in really good journals, which are of high quality, and see what kind of things they mention, and make sure you have at least the same kind of information. Why I underlined aspects that can influence the outcomes, because I didn't say you have to report everything that can be important for the study. For example, if you mark animals and you mark them with a blue marker, if you do a study on normal behavior observations or something, it might not matter at all that the marker is blue. The animals, maybe they don't see it. It's fine. You don't have to say it's a blue marker, but you do have to say you marked animals. If it is about observations with automatic observations with a camera, and it matters how the marking is in contrast with the background, it is really important that it's blue, or another color, of course. And then you absolutely have to mention that the marking is blue. So it depends on the study design for what is important. But you have to mention all these tiny details that can influence how someone else would conduct a study and would get the same outcomes. So if the design is not correct, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's little that can be done to change it, but you can then the next best thing is to be honest about it. So you provide sufficient details in the methods so that people don't get confused. You don't try to cover it up, because someone else will notice it after a while, after proper reading. Better is to just say why, because we all know that research on animals goes differently than plants, and then it's better to say why it went differently and how someone else can maybe avoid this. If it's better to remove part of the data because some of the part of the data might be a weakness, or doing extra analysis, then always consider this, because it's not always that publishing everything is not always better. Sometimes it's better to just leave away some of the data that might be weak. And of course, before you even start to study, it's better to take into account what is a design that results in the end in publishable research. So you have to know the literature and make clearly testable research questions. You have to consider your design and not just study or do a study on whatever there's available to look at. I know it's very tempting that if you need to supervise students by choice or not by choice, and you need to give them a project of something to do, then well, here is something to do. But then it's fine for a student project, but then it just shouldn't be published. If it doesn't have any structure or doesn't make sense or it's not a proper design, then better just to leave it as for what it is and not try to get it published. See what is the other research that is going on and what is currently the norms, especially with statistical analysis. Do sample size calculations, and again, not just whatever is available, and discuss with others, especially internationally, because that is really what we need that there is more international discussion about research designs so that others in other countries can learn from each other. And of course, as I mentioned, animal trials never go as expected. You have to factor it in. So if you calculate that you need 6 animals for study, you can almost guarantee 1 animal, will get sick or something happens. Always plan some extra animals. Keep an eye on the time. Laura, I won't keep it much longer, okay? So for the sample size, if it is allowed to go for peer review, if it's not rejected straight away because of the low sample size, then in the manuscript, again, be transparent. If you planned a much larger sample size, but it didn't happen because animals got sick, animals had to be removed from the experiment because it was too severe or something else happened, then explain it. Otherwise, others might do the same study and have the same failure. So be clear about what happens. I know some journals set really strict word counts for how long a manuscript may be. And then to describe such details in such tight word space is a challenge. Luckily, there are options for supplementary files, and really do use it for such details about why things happened which weren't supposed to happen. If you have a justified reason for a low sample size, then explain it. And the best way is to already explain it in the cover letter to the editor. This cover letter doesn't get published, and it doesn't seem to matter so much as an author. As an author, you might write a cover letter and think, who sees this? The editor sees it, and we get happy from cover letters sometimes. But no, we read it, and if you dare give a justification, then it helps to make evaluation about the study. Certainly, if you're working on a species that is rare, that is difficult to find, you can't capture endangered animals in the hundreds. So, if you have a good reason, then just explain it to the editor, but also in the manuscript. And if you have a limited sample size, you can also do limited statistics. And sometimes we see very complex designs on a very small sample, and then it's just, then it seems big, but actually it just needs to be reduced in complexity. And with limited sample size, especially, keep the results within their context. No overstatements about that you find a new method for something on 4 animals. That's just taking it too broad. So I'm not going to repeat this one. Okay, I'm also not going too much into statistics. The main thing is, there's almost always comments by reviewers about statistics, and mostly lead to a major revision. That's just because there are many ways to do statistical analysis, and it's not that one way is correct, but there are many ways to do it incorrect as well. So if you have good data, it can become very wrong with the wrong analysis. Also, it can lead to completely wrong conclusions. So it is essential to provide all the information and all the details from the statistical model so that the reviewers can assess if the analysis is actually valid. Then stay up to date with statistical knowledge, because it just keeps on evolving. What we did 10 years ago is now completely incorrect. We are all part of it, that we did it. We can't say we did it wrong in the past. It was not the right knowledge yet. So now that it's changing, and we have to just keep up to date. The authors, the editors, and the reviewers. And if a reviewer says it has to be different to statistics, then it's just a learning opportunity. Maybe this reviewer knows much more about statistics, recent statistics, than you. Maybe not, maybe it's completely outdated. The best thing is to look it up and test it and know for yourself if the comment from the reviewer is correct or not. If not, then you provide a proper, solid argumentation of why you think that according to the common way of doing, or the current most recent way of doing statistics, is not correct. Otherwise, at least you have to show that you tried it, So see it as a good learning opportunity. And if you consult a statistician, this is absolutely recommended. And you can also write it in the cover letter, because that gives the editor a better way of making a judgment on, certainly when there are intense debates between author and reviewer about which statistics are correct, then get a statistician. So I was not meant to speak about revisions, because revisions was not part of the plan, but I just wanted to say the last few things. The comments from reviewers can be rude and harsh. Don't be defeated or angry or upset by the reviewer, because these are just busy people who voluntarily accepted to help you. So they don't get anything for it. They just give their free time, often in the night. Just address all the comments in as clear and simple way as possible, because if they have to look at it again and you write a lengthy argument of why you agree or not agree with them, they have to read it all again, and they waste more of their time on looking at your manuscript. It's not wasted time fully, but if it can be more time efficient, is better. So they just try to help, be very polite, and there's no need to complain about people who try to help you, otherwise it doesn't get published. Mainly see it as an opportunity to improve your work and learn something new. And then it will just, if you have a positive attitude about this, then it will be more easy to motivate you to go through all these comments. Some reviewers are really nice, and you're happy. Some are not nice. It's still helpful for your manuscript. In the end, it's about scientific quality and not about how people give feedback, because not everyone is good at giving feedback. So just as a final slide. Oh no, it's not a final slide, but I'm almost there. Sorry, Laura. Prior to the manuscript, so check the literature, design it well, follow the guidelines at the cover letter, because it's nice for the editor. Proofread it and aim for a perfect submission, because peer review is not to correct an immature manuscript. Don't send your students dissertation at all. This will just spike rejection rates. Just have a perfect submission, and then it usually goes all right. There are many free online sources on how you can improve your writing skills, or about the publication process itself, or how you do peer review. This one is from Elsevier, but I know there are many others out there. So just upgrade your skills if you want to be more successful. Then the really last one is what I just wanted to say is that many journals are, all journals are getting increasingly competitive, and they push for faster timelines, and usually it's automatic messages. There's no human behind a lot of these messages and invitations. So as author or reviewer, ignore the irrelevant messages and challenge the ones that are unreasonable. If they ask you to submit your revisions in a week or in 2 days and you need much more time, then just ask for an extension, because these journals send the messages and they set their timelines for their own benefit. That's not in the benefit of science. It only leads to stress and poor research quality, and that's not in the benefit of any of the research or the animals involved. So just email the editor, check the status of your manuscript. If it takes longer than two months, then write the editor as well to ask what is happening, because otherwise if you're waiting for too long, it's completely fair to write an email and say, hey, where's my manuscript? Why don't I have a decision yet? Maybe a bit politer way, but make sure you email a person instead of a robot, and prioritize research quality over speed of publication. Just ask for an extension. That's completely normal. Last message, don't get stressed when it's not needed. Just stay calm and do good research, and ignore all those journals or not the journals, but all those messages that push for faster work. So that was it. Thanks. Sorry, not much time for questions, but
anyway. No, sorry. Thank you so much for sharing such a clear and thorough guidelines. And it's so true that we need these standards to deal with the reproducibility crisis. So thank you for all of your suggestions. You mentioned a few times that we should consider discussing the design with international researchers. And I agree that you can learn a lot from that process of collaboration and discussing before starting a project. Do you have any recommendations for how people might start those conversations or meetings? For example, should new studies have like a board of research partners to have some accountability, or preprints, or some other ideas to help people get started?
Well, of course, preprints are a direction where you can already publish what you're planning to do. And then it's clear that, well, if you're the first with the idea, but you're not the first to publish, then at least, it's documented when you already submitted your idea for the journal. But I'm not sure if everyone sees that. I think the projects in which there's a lot of collaboration, but not only projects, but also things like Slack, actually, where there's so many people involved, and just simply putting out a message, is anyone working on this topic? Although it's risky because then they might steal your topic. That happens. But yeah, to talk with others, and then you actually hear how many people are working on things, but they don't have it published yet. And then that's the only way to realize that you're working on something similar sometimes, because it takes so much time to publish the work after the project is started. But it's frustrating to start to write a publication, and you write, this is the first study to look at this and that, and then someone else is just before you, or your design turns out to be wrong and someone else was doing it correctly. But if you would have collaborated, or not even collaborated, but just speaking to each other, then that helps.
Thanks for that answer. While we're waiting for more questions to come in the chat box, you didn't talk too much about it, but kind of flipping things a bit. Do you have any suggestions for reviewers for how to give more meaningful and useful feedback? For example, should the first time you review a paper, you give general comments and then be more specific when the scientists haven't addressed the nitty-gritty details? Do you have any thoughts as an editor on that side?
As a reviewer, you usually first give some general comments and then specific detailed comments.
You mentioned that often there can be lots of comments and they might not be the most pleasant to read. So should we rethink the review process to more make it a teaching opportunity, instead of you need to do these 100 lines of things before I'll review it again?
No. reviewers just should be paid, I think. Who's going to pay? The publisher should pay, because it is now a voluntary job, but it takes, well, from several hours to several days to review a manuscript. And it's just based on interest from the reviewers to think like, well, I would read it anyway if it would get published. But then if you're lucky, it's a good publication and you don't spend too long hours on it. But if you think it's a good manuscript and you accept to review it and it turns out to be poor and you're busy on it for days, then who is, if you consider how much researchers get paid in a day, then why is it something that is voluntary? So that's the whole system is a bit flawed, but we have to find ways to escape it, but we can't just stop it from one day to the other. It's a gradual process. Luckily, some people are kicking the system. But the main thing was, if you decide to review, give a proper review and not just a sentence, nice paper. As editor and as author, you can't do anything with it because, it's never a nice paper. There's always something to comment on. It just doesn't happen. Few times with you have just a few sentences, but usually you have pages full. And then it contributes to making the publication better. But there's no certain guideline for it. Depends on the quality of the manuscript.
But I agree completely that reviewers should be paid. So Beerta has a comment. As editors, we can't always have time when the automatic messages are sent. So please don't get upset if you receive an email on a weekend or a bank holiday. Just assume that the deadlines, sometimes only 48 hours, always refer to usual working days and they get extended accordingly. And thank you for that, Beerta, because I get those kind of things all the time.
Yes, it's nerve-wracking, these automatic messages that go to reviewers, authors, and editors as well. We also get these messages like you're overdue with your manuscript, and it's like, what? But it's weekend, and they send something on Friday after 6, and they expect a response in 48 hours, indeed, and just ignore it. It's computers anyway. Don't get stressed about this. No one is going to kick your paper out of the system, even though some people may think it happens like this, or they may threaten. It's not going to happen. Journals want to publish good papers. If you have a good paper, it doesn't matter if you ask several times for a month extension. It's about research quality, not about making the publishers richer, or it shouldn't be.
Thanks, Irene. Thanks, Beerta, for that huge relief. Andrea says, as an editor, what's your opinion on negative results? As in, what if I'm looking into differences in my population, but I find nothing? Would that be considered interesting and novel enough to be published?
Yes, publish it, because we have to fight the publication bias, which indeed that's some journals want to publish the most attractive research, and they are rejecting maybe negative results because of they are selective. But as I said, it's not about printing journals so much anymore. So there should be less and less of this selectivity in journals. And if the research design is valid, then a negative result is an absolutely true result, which is equally relevant as any other result. Of course, hypothesis, it would be strange if all hypotheses that we come up are completely as we think they would be. That would be a strange way of doing science. And it's even stranger that we don't accept this in publications. So, yeah.
Great. Zimbabwe says, hi, that was a great talk. Congratulations. Could you please talk a bit more about the sample size section? How to justify the absence of sample size calculation when there similar studies have not been found?
Okay, it's sometimes difficult to do sample size calculations if you have no reference. No one else looked at it before. You don't have a means, you don't have a standard deviation, and then you can't do really a proper sample size. That's why you do pilot studies usually to get a kind of means and standard deviation. Sometimes you can't do sample pilot studies, and then you go with previous studies which have done something similar. If that's not the case for what you're doing exactly, then try to find the closest thing that relates to it, maybe in a different species or so. But if that's really the case, then well, add a few animals extra, because if it is risky to just take a study from someone else and say, well, they have this amount of numbers, then maybe it will work or not. But within reason, of course, because you can't take suddenly too many animals.
Great. Mila says, thanks for this insightful presentation. You mentioned the importance of novelty and also the fact that a researcher should take their time to do good research, get the right study design, stats, writing, etc. Sometimes the trade-off between all this is just overwhelming, and novelty is lost down the road, given that so much time is needed to get every single detail sorted. Can you comment on that?
Oh, that's research. You signed up for it, otherwise. Yeah. No. No, I don't know. Yeah, I think novelty is what makes it nice to keep doing research, because you can come up with all these strange things that no one else thought about. But I know this is not for every researcher to think in this way. And in that case, team up with someone who thinks like this, of finding everything that is strange and new and hasn't been researched, a challenge to think about. Because, as a researcher, everyone has their own qualities. Some may be good in design, some may be good in stats, and others in writing, and others are just good in generating novel ideas. And good science comes from good teams and not just from people working on their own in isolation. So just form a good research team or group, or just a collaboration somewhere.
And that goes back to your earlier comment of make sure you're working with colleagues outside of your institution to reflect on these ideas and build up a dynamic team. Mila also says, could you comment on review papers? Are there any tips to make sure that your review is standing outside the crowd?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you for this question. Because review papers are very often rejected. They have a much higher rejection rate than the normal original research papers, because the quality is poor or because it's not novel enough. I would say just follow guidelines for systematic reviews these days, because that's also the standard from current journals. Don't just try to publish the introduction of a PhD dissertation or some master study literature review, or just some ideas put together from research that because it will be rejected likely. Yeah, a proper review paper takes a lot of work, and then that should also deliver good quality, but plan a review with a sound scientific base, so that if someone else wants to write the same review, they could duplicate it by following the same methods as you did.
Thank you for that. And I think those are all of the questions. So again, Irene, thank you
on time.
Thank you so much for your time and your very thorough presentation. I think it will be useful for all of us and for future students that need to get started.
Yes, and if there are any more questions, just email me. I put my email up there, because that's a part of the role of editor, to help people hopefully before they submit rather than after they submit.
Thank you.